Hello and welcome. This is 360 Dialogue here on Third Eye Africa Television. I am Juliet Onwura. Good to have you join us on this episode where we'll be talking about sub-regional security and transnational insurgency in Africa. We're looking at West Africa, but we're talking about Africa in general. You know, insurgency, terrorism, banditry, and all that. Criminal elements are infiltrating our borders, and there has been like a transnational or transitioning of criminal activities across West Africa. And today, to do justice on this topic, I have a good hand here in the studio. His name is Bashiru Muhammad. He's a Ghanaian researcher and community activist with advanced degree in Islamic studies and peace and security. His work focuses on the intersection of Islamic law, human security, and conflict resolution. Bashiru, you're welcome to 360 Dialogue.
Thank you very much, Juliet.
So all the way from Ghana, he has crossed the borders. He has passed, how do they say that? They say you cross 9 seas, and there's an adage like that. But you've actually come so far to be here in Nigeria, and we're very happy to have you here. Let's just go straight to the borders of, Africa, especially in West Africa. How would you describe, the borders? People often say, oh, Africa, once they talk about Africa, West Africa, they say, oh, the borders are porous. In your own view, what would you describe it as?
Okay, thank you very much for this wonderful opportunity. My special greetings to your viewers, to your audience. Nigeria is a very big place. It's a very hospitable place. I hope the hospitality will increase with time. Coming back to your substantive question, West African borders. Now, when we discuss issues of borders, I want to make this point clear. And it's good that when you look at the African states and issue of African borders, there is this whole idea of something we call state hybridity.
State hybridity.
Okay. To understand African borders, you have to understand the nature of the African state, which a lot of academics have argued that intrinsically the African state is a hybridized state. When I say a hybridized state, I'm talking about the fact that the state is not that typical Western state that you find, which is based on, to some extent, on the teachings of Max Weber. Max Weber described the state as an autonomous entity which exercises legitimate force, legitimate force over a group of people. And so that is the state. But when you look at the African state, you don't really find some of these features present in the African state because of this issue of state hybridity that I mentioned. So on one hand, you have the government. On the other hand, you have the existence of other semi-autonomous institutions. You have our chieftaincy institutions. You have our traditional institutions. You have our religious institutions, which are to some extent competing with the central authority over this whole issue of autonomy. So you do have people within, let's say, Nigeria, whose allegiance doesn't really go to the central or the federal government. I'm saying central government because I'm a Ghanaian. Okay. They see themselves more as, being aligned with their local system. Okay. So if the person is in a village and let's say he's Igbo or he's Yoruba and he's living in a very remote area, who is connected to the chief of that place, his allegiance, first of all, is to the chief rather than to the federal authority. Okay. So that's this whole idea of state hybridity. Now, why is this relevant? This is relevant because it then affects the issues of borders. If this community is, a border community, then you will have an issue controlling security or, porosity at the borders. Because for instance, if I am Yoruba and I have a Yoruba cousin who is also in Benin, and we are living at a border town, and the government imposes a lockdown, let's say during COVID, and my cousin, who is living in that part, which is known as Benin, and I'm living in Nigeria, and he wants to cross, and I can help the person, no matter what, I will allow the person to come in. You understand me? So all of these things contribute to the process whereby the federal government or the government of the day is unable to exercise, enormous control as seen in that Western, understanding of how a state is supposed to function. So this problem is not just linked to, African societies alone.
Okay.
A number of countries within the third world face this problem. So for instance, when you look at Afghanistan and Pakistan, this whole idea of smuggling is a huge problem. Because there are Afghans living at the Pakistani border who don't see themselves as having allegiance to the government. And so they trade. So the government imposes certain tariffs. They don't abide by the tariffs because they see people at the other side as casuals. So you come to Africa, this problem exists. You go to northern Nigeria, there are Hausa-speaking people at the north, Hausa-speaking people in southern Niger. How do you exercise, effective control? You go to Ghana, Ghana's border with Burkina Faso. You have Mosi-speaking Ghanaians at the northernmost part of the country. And you have Mosi-speaking Burkinabes, and you have Bisa-speaking Burkinabes, who see the people on the other side as their cousins. These are more or less the same people. Now, as a central governor, how do you effect, effective control over these people? So this whole idea that researchers refer to as the state or the hybridization of the African state makes effective control very, very difficult. Okay. And so based on that, yes, the borders are porous. But that does not mean that measures have not been put in place. People keep saying borders are porous, but you don't know how effective the border is until you try moving and you are asked certain questions to produce certain documents. When you're unable to produce them, that is where you understand that the systems are really working. But, there is no system which functions 100%. You understand me? So, yes, systems are working, but at the same time, there are cracks. Okay. And I hope this discussion will bring us some of these cracks, and we see how best we can mend some of these cracks. So yes, the borders are porous, but again, governments, West African governments are trying their best to secure our borders. Okay.
That's a good one. I like your thoughts on that porosity, if I may put it, on the borders. You said systems are working, because when we talk about borders, for people like myself who hasn't been exposed to border to see what's going on in the border, I wouldn't understand that the systems are working because of how porous the borders are. But the infiltration of criminal elements or whatever, is it due to the system? You said it's effective, so we can't blame it on the system. But is it more on the structure? Because there are a lot of, should I say, the border is vast. So you can't tell me you can put like a structure from A to Z of the land. Do you get? So how effective you also spoke about, the government and also other semi-autonomous institutions like religious leaders, community leaders. How effective can this joint task force, be put together in curbing, border insurgent movement of terrorists and other things?
So I started the discussion the way I did, so as for our viewers to understand the nature of the problem. So if you have someone, let's say, staying in Borno, for instance, who is Kanuri, and that person, feels that, governmental interventions have not really benefited his or her community. Okay. And you have a group that live across the border who are Kanuri speaking also. First of all, these two groups, even though they are living in different state entities, but they have a common culture that unites them. They have a common understanding that unites them. When one feels that my dealings with this side is better than my dealings with the central government, then you have a problem. Because the person is living at the border. Look at where Abuja is. Look at the distance. So the person is able to relate with groups from the other side of the border. So if these people don't really have, incentives to remain faithful to the federal government, then forget it. You understand? We can sit in the town centers and we can discuss these issues, but fundamentally, structures are very, very important. And when I talk about structures, I'm not just referring to the fact that you put particular systems in place. I'm talking about the fact that putting systems that recognize that people have, specific needs. When you meet those needs, then you win their allegiance. And so if the government is unable to provide, for the needs of the people, and other groups are able, be rest assured that people living in the borders will owe their allegiance to these other groups who are providing or catering for their needs. And this is particularly important when you look at, the nature of the African state. Let me just chip in this. Places like US, Donald Trump was talking about constructing a border along the US-Mexican border. Now, that's a very advanced country, which is facing this challenge. So if we are also facing the challenge, that is not new. But for me, I think that when we bring out solutions that take into consideration the nature of the African state, then we can address some of these things. Rather than, centralized control, if we can decentralize some of these, then I think we will be in a better position to address some of these issues.
So you're talking more about decentralizing,
Exactly.
border control rather than just from the federal government down to the border communities. Okay, speaking on border communities, we know that they are much more at the receiving end when it comes to, insurgent attack, criminal elements, infiltration, and all that. Do you think sub-regional security can be achieved without them?
Of course not. So there are two types of ensuring, of course, peace and security. There are basically some theories. There is one theory that says that peace is basically order. So like you put in a strong man or a strong woman, who then brings out, gives gives decisions, give directives, and that is it. And there are others who argue that no, use the bottom-up approach.
Okay.
The order is basically top-bottom. So you impose the peace and security. Now there are others who say, looking at the nature of the African society, it's better to address it from bottom-up. Bottom-up. So when you look at it from that angle, then the involvement of border communities become very, very important. Because you look at their system, because these communities were living long before the emergence of the modern state. We were living as one people. And one day, Europeans decided to sit at the Berlin Conference. This part is Togo, this part is Ghana, this part is Nigeria. And so the local structures that we have pre-existed these borders that were created.
That's right.
And so if you come up with, structures that, take into consideration the needs of the border communities, I think that, is a better way of providing security rather than using the other approach that I've mentioned. This top-bottom approach, you sit at the center, you suggest policy directives. And so, yes, to answer your question, we cannot achieve border security without incorporating or taking into consideration the systems that exist in, border communities.
Just to talk more on this theory where, the first one is the top to bottom, where they impose the peace and security, and the other one is really from down to top, where they carry the community along into peace and security. Now, looking at that, is this the reason why, we're talking about the imposing the peace and security now? Is that why we're seeing more of, local communities tilting more towards where they have to benefit? You talked about incentive. They dwell more on incentive from, people they can benefit more from. So let's assume that, okay, there are terrorist group or whatever that are neighboring very close to their borders that has dominated that area. And now they have to pay allegiance to these people because they are getting incentive or they are benefiting from them more than the federal government. Do you think that's the problem?
Okay, so we cannot mention one factor as being the cause of it.
Okay.
So, for instance, you cannot just say because the borders are porous. That is just the factor. No, there are economic factors.
Okay.
You understand me? If you have, let's say, the needs of people in place, people have different security needs. You are a female, I am male. We all have different security needs. You know, when you fail to take into consideration the security needs of people, and you want to sit at the center and impose, there will always be problems.
Okay.
You understand me? So one thing that it does is that it gives short-term security. Short-term security. So if you have, you know, a strong man in place or a strong woman in place, like some will say like a military junta or a military government in place, who is able to exert effective control, you can have security. But what happens? What happens when the strong man is no more? You know, let me just cite Iraq as an example. Look at what Iraq is going through now. Under Saddam Hussein, we didn't have that problem because you had a strong man in place.
Okay.
Now Saddam Hussein is no more. Look at what is happening. And so that's usually the problem when you try to approach security and peace using order. You might have short-term, you know, short-term results, but the long-term becomes a problem. So yes, I think what you've mentioned is linked to this. But you know, I am arguing that for us to make it sustainable and for us to get long-term implications, let's take the needs, you know, of these border communities into consideration. And as I said, people have different security needs. Once we come up with programs and projects which address the fundamental needs that people are going through, you know, if it is education, some of these communities, you know, education is a major problem. If you address educational needs, we address health needs, we address, you know, certain fundamental infrastructure that, you know, we're able to provide for these people, then the long-term implication is that you are enhancing security.
Yes.
You know, see, education does a lot. Believe me, education does a lot. It's very expensive, but there are a number of graduates out there who cannot find jobs. But again, they cannot go to some of these communities and engage in banditry activities because of the kind of education that they went to. I hope you get the point I'm making. So that is one thing that education does. So if we are able to provide for some of these needs, you understand me, then we are providing a long-term solution to some of these challenges beyond the economic side of it, which of course pull factors, as we refer to them. These are pull factors and push factors. Sometimes unfortunately, sometimes the actions of and inactions of governments themselves push some of these people.
That's right.
You understand?
That's why the education.
Very, very important. Even beyond education, let's see, look at it. When you have, so there are systems in place to address the needs of people. That's why we have, so if I have an issue with you, I'm supposed to use a legal channel to address it, right? Now, if I take the law into my own hands, what am I doing to you? When you also have the opportunity, you will also take the law into your own hands. So that's why I'm talking about this, that we put systems in place and make sure that systems work. You understand me? Systems for resolving differences that people go through. But when you engage the security services into issues wherein you have, you know, laws in place to address, then you create problem.
That's right.
Yeah, so that's also part of the problem. That you do have people joining some of these groups because their rights have been trampled upon. You know, by the central government or by the federal government.
We all understand the same. We're talking about the same thing. Okay, I want us to really understand the importance of community borders, and I would want you to highlight, you know, the roles of community borders, or border communities, pardon me on that, border communities now, and possible way that these parties now can ensure, you know, be it both the influence of the federal government, both the influence of religious leaders and, you know, whatever institutions that influence these border communities. What are their roles, and how can we ensure, or how can the federal government and the other stakeholders involved ensure security at border communities?
So first of all, engagement is very, very important. So when these communities are engaged, when the structures they have in place already are improved. As I said, these communities were living long before, we have our modern borders. So if the systems that they have in place, rather than scrapping all this system, if you improve on the system, I don't know if you understand the argument, the solution I'm offering. So like I said, these communities were there long before the modern borders, and they had systems in place to address, some of these issues. So if those systems are improved, so like at the center, these systems are engaged and the systems are improved, rather than imposing imposing new systems. Let me just cite an example. As I mentioned, so the southern Nigerian border with Benin have Yoruba-speaking people, inhabiting that area. So Yoruba, as a tribe, has within its systems in place how you treat your neighbor, early warning system within that communal structure. Now, if these communal structures are engaged and are improved, you understand me. So if these are engaged and these are improved, I think that is a better way of handling this issue. You can put all the security personnel you have. You cannot put security personnel at every entry or exit point.
Okay.
But these communities are such that, for instance, now, if we go to any border community and people see us, they know we are strangers. It is something that you can't explain, but the people living there. So, for instance, Ghana's border with Togo, Aflao. Once I get to Aflao and those living there, once they see me, they know I'm not from this town. So if they are engaged very well, to provide intelligence. You understand? Once I'm seen, once I'm spotted, someone can just relay the info to, you understand, within, based on the kind of system that is developed. Some of these information can just be relayed. Okay. You understand me? So basically that's what I'm saying. We cannot achieve border security without taking into consideration the needs and the systems that border communities already have in place. That's basically what I'm saying.
Interesting. That's really interesting. And when you talk about engagement, okay, I would want us to, I don't know if it's so in Ghana, but right here in Nigeria, there's should I call it a policy, or let me just call it a policy, and I don't know the right word, but let me call it a policy. So there's this state policing that is to be put in place due to, the insurgents and state criminality going on, where your communities are the one in charge of security. I don't know if that's the engagement you're talking about.
Yes. So that is what I'm talking about. But of course, the effectiveness of this system that I'm suggesting will also depend on other factors, other related factors. For instance, if the community doesn't trust the governance structure, do you think they will relay the information? I don't know if you understand the point I'm making. So if, let's say, someone living in a border community encounters a stranger, right? And he feels that this should get to the authorities. But if I don't trust the authority, will I relay the information out? Exactly the point. And so, yes, the solution I'm suggesting is also a solution, but that will also depend on other factors. For instance, if I feel that the problems that the community is facing is as a result of the government, you understand, I feel the government is a problem, I won't engage with the government, because I feel that the government hasn't done what it's supposed to do for my needs. You understand me? So that is a solution, but that in itself is dependent on a wide range of factors. Beyond this, Juliet, weak governance is very, very an important aspect of the discussion.
Okay.
government exists for the needs of the people. If, as citizens, we are, detached from the projects of the government, when basically we see the government as an enemy, based on the policies that the government has maybe done over the years, then believe me, this problem will keep lingering. Because as I said, government exists for the needs of the people. When government is detached from that, when you have big governance in place, then you can't, like what is happening in the Sahel. It's not that governments don't exist, but there are some areas that government is not able to effectively exercise its control. It's a huge territory. That's like 3 times the size of France. You're dealing with a huge territory, dealing with different kinds of people.
Diversity.
How do you exert effective control over these people if you fail to provide for their needs? You understand me? So basically, this is what I think, that yes, the solution we are suggesting is very important, but we cannot delink that from the activities of the government also.
That's right. So for proper engagement to be put in place, not just do they need to involve the communities, they also need to should I say gain the trust of the people with good governance.
Make them part of the government structure. So if let's say people living in border communities feel that they have a voice in the government structure, you see, let's say, a community leader offering solutions for policy. You see that you realize that those solutions are actually, even if not all of them, but those solutions are ahead. What does that do to the community? They feel they're part of the government structure. Once they feel they're part of the government structure, then they will cooperate with government. But if I don't see myself as part of the government structure, I don't have any affinity with the government structure, then I will do whatever that I want to do for my needs. As I said, people have needs, and it's all about who can help provide for my needs. You understand me? So when we did, let me just chip in this. I remember when we did Islamic, some of these groups that are using Islam to create, these groups that are like Boko Haram and the rest. Some of the factors that were mentioned was that you find in some places in the north where some women were denied access to Islamic education. Some parts of the north, for whatever reason. Then you have these groups sending agents, promising these women, because nothing in Islam prevents the woman from being educated. So you had this group promising the woman, but the woman didn't know that there was an agenda behind it. They didn't, so they subscribed because they were looking for education. You understand? And the group was provided, but they didn't know they were being brainwashed. You understand? So these were people who were who subscribed to that ideology because their needs were being met, their needs for education. You understand? So, as I said, when people feel detached from government or from policies, they will find other ways and means to have their needs, to cater for their needs. And so these are also part of the challenges.
Okay, let's talk more right now on insurgency. Is the spread of insurgency in the coastal West Africa and other African states, is it at all inevitable?
So looking at, so there are a number of factors. Inevitable. You have some academics arguing that this whole discussion around the spread of insurgency is based on a theory we call securitization theory.
Okay.
Within the academy, we call it securitization theory. That is where you deliberately create an issue as a security issue. You deliberate, it's deliberate. Using media and other tools, you create an issue as a security issue. Meanwhile, there are more pressing issues that is in need of intervention than the particular issue that you are making noise around. I don't know whether you understand.
It's actually complicated.
Okay, so you create an issue around a specific issue. You securitize it. In other words, you keep talking about it, talking about it. when there exist other important issues that can be addressed.
Okay.
And when those are addressed, this one will be addressed.
Okay. Yes.
But you don't spend time on this. So like you have A and B. When A is addressed, B will be addressed.
Definitely be addressed.
But you spend time on B, making noise around B, forgetting A. Then people's attention go to B, when in fact A is a more pressing issue. So we call that securitization theory. Terrorism and insurgency thrive on a number of fundamental factors. When those factors are addressed, terrorism and insurgency will cease to exist. Now, why not channel the energy into addressing some of these issues rather than making the noise that insurgency is an issue? Insurgency. That's basically what the theory is saying. So, to answer the question whether it's inevitable, I don't want to say yes and I don't want to say no.
Okay.
But the point is there are certain fundamental issues that when those issues are not addressed, those issues will likely link to this issue of insurgency that we are talking about. There are fundamental issues that we have to deal with beyond merely engaging the military.
Okay.
There are fundamental issues. Nigerians have issues. West Africans have issues. When those issues are not addressed, the long-term implication is that the youth might likely join insurgency groups. So rather than focusing on this, why not address those issues? Insurgency thrives where there is unemployment. It thrives where there is unemployment because, as I said, there are economic incentives to get young people join insurgency groups. So if there are economic, incentives why people are joining, why not create alternative economic opportunities for the youth? Africa has one of the largest youthful populations that you can think of. There are countries in Europe that basically have aging population. Russia is one. Italy is also traversing that path. And that's why there is this incentive for people to move to the West because of the aging population they are having. Africa has a youthful population. Now, that is positive and that is negative. When the youth are not engaged in positive, productive ventures, then you can be rest assured some will likely end up being influenced by insurgency groups. And so if we sit around it and we think it's not a problem, then yes, insurgency will spread because these young people who have nothing doing will definitely be recruited. And they will be recruited and they will be paid. A man must survive. You understand? So I can't say yes, I can't say no. When we fail to address the fundamental issues, yes, it will spread. There was a time that these discussions were, these issues were pertinent to North Africans. It was never an issue of the Sahel, never an issue of West Africa.
That's right.
Now it's an issue. That's because we fail to address, the structural issues that I talked about, the fundamental issues. If our young people are engaged, our young people are able to provide, there are opportunities available for growth. If our young people have things doing, think about it, Juliet. When it's election, how tense is the country?
Very tense.
Now, if you have something...
Not just in Nigeria, but
exactly,
across Africa.
Yes, it's very tense. But if you have something doing, Ghana, the last election we had, I observed the election for one of our communities. It was a very tense, things were very tense, and I wrote that in my report. A neighboring community, when I went there, as if there was nothing happening because people were engaged.
Okay.
The second community is basically a business community. So after casting their ballot, people went in to engage in their normal business activity as if nothing was happening. But community A, where I was an observer, people had nothing doing. So if they had nothing to do, what do you think they will do? So that's basically the point I'm making. That community A, you had young people having interest in the election because they had nothing doing. And so if we fail to engage our youth and we fail to provide productive ventures for our youth, and a number of the youth don't understand why Africa has this huge resource potential and still nothing for the youth. And this is actually one of the reasons that push people. So I don't know whether I've answered your question. I don't want to say yes and create fear and panic.
Yes.
But using securitization theory, insurgency thrives on a number of structural causes. When we fail to address those causes, then it will spread.
Okay, still using this theory, let's look at Africa. Let's look at Nigeria and Ghana as a case study. If the country is focusing on insurgents right now, or taking its gaze away from insurgent to hunger, employment, do you think it's going to look good at the initial stage, or do you think it should be run concurrently?
So there are two approaches. One approach, of course, short-term approach, impose order. These places where the insurgents are active, you have to impose order. When I mentioned peace and security as order,
so
because you want a short-term solution.
Okay.
If you don't, it will keep continuing. So that's where you engage, our men in uniform to address it within the short term. But that shouldn't, you should have a long-term solution. So the long-term solution is what you have mentioned. You understand me that issues of hunger, issues of economic opportunities, issues of education, issues of health. Health is of primary importance. You understand? Very, very important. If these issues are addressed in the long term, then we have a long-term solution. So looking at what is happening, we cannot focus on a long-term solution. What then happens within the short term? So you need both.
Exactly.
So resources should be dedicated to, to addressing it within the short term. But our objective is to address it within the long term. And that is where we have to address some of these structural underlying causes.
So it's deploying both short and long term concurrently.
Exactly, yes.
To pursue a safer Africa.
Yes.
Okay, let's talk about neighboring countries that right now, the infiltration of security. Do you think how one country fights against insurgents affects the other country? Just briefly on that.
Yes, exactly. Very, very important. I think as a people, we need to be collective, in addressing this issue of insurgency. If Ghana thinks it's Nigeria's problem, eventually it will get to Ghana. So we have to be collective in addressing it. When we are collective, then we are in a better position to address some of this. Because if, let's say, Nigeria imposes a number of measures that are very effective within Nigeria, they will move to other countries.
Exactly.
And they will infiltrate the borders and fight Nigerians using other countries as their base.
Yeah.
You understand me? So that's why I say we have to be collective. When we are collective, understand that the enemy is not the terrorist. The enemy is terrorism. There are two different things.
Okay.
Terrorism is the enemy, not the terrorist.
Okay.
Terrorism is an idea. And ideas are out there for people to grasp. So once you understand that the idea is a problem, then we will do something about our educational system. Then we will do something about how we, bring up our children. Then we understand that families have a role to play. When the family structure collapses, you understand it, then you will have this issue. But if the family structure is working, then the understanding is before you move out of the family structure, the family should raise you up in a particular way, whereby even if terrorist groups are inviting you, because of the upbringing you got within the family, you will say no to that idea. So we need a collective effort.
Okay.
ECOWAS and the broader AU, we need a collective effort in addressing this.
I like that you've mentioned that, but we'll go on a short break, and when we're back, we'll talk more on, collective effort, ECOWAS, AU, and all that. Do stay with us. Hello and welcome back. If you're just tuning in, you're quite on time. We've been having a wonderful conversation here on 360U Dialogue, where we've been having a conversation on sub-regional security and transnational insurgency in Africa. We're taking a look at West Africa. And before we took a break, my guest here, Bashiru Muhammad, who is a researcher, not a scholar. He said he's a researcher. So he has said a lot on, insurgency, border communities, and Africa's porous borders so far. And I would want us to go back from where we stopped, where we spoke about collective fighting of border insurgency in Africa as a whole. And you made mention of ECOWAS. What does that mean? What does this mean? Where we're seeing Mali, we're seeing Niger, we're seeing Burkina Faso, and we're seeing another alliance, a fragmented alliance coming up. What does that really mean for security in Africa?
So, in fact, there are a number of discussions around what's happening.
Okay.
There were some thinkers that I listened to who saw this coming. They saw this coming. They argue that ECOWAS was formed based on certain objectives, based on certain values.
Okay.
And they felt that once ECOWAS begins to drift away, in their view, from those values, the problems that you see will keep happening. And it will not just be limited to these countries, that other countries will follow. That's one. Two, ECOWAS doesn't really, the power of ECOWAS is actually restricted. You understand? Where you look at issues of state sovereignty and the sovereignty within the sub-region. Do states do they owe allegiance to ECOWAS beyond the restricted or limited power that ECOWAS has? So if, let's say, Ghana decides to exit ECOWAS, what power does ECOWAS have to stop that? Because the states are actually autonomous, so to say. And so once you have this challenge of this whole issue of autonomy and sovereignty at the state level, then it's just a matter of time that the state feels that, okay, I want to opt out of the sub-regional body. There is nothing you can do. You know, so that is also another. So these two things make it very challenging for the sub-regional body. Why did I mention this? Now, there are a number of thinkers who argue that there were instances that other democratic countries, constitutional coups were orchestrated, and the sub-regional body kept quiet. So, for instance, if, let's say, country A has a 4-year mandate for the executive, and it's almost 4 years, and the executive decide to amend the constitution just before election. Now that's a coup. You know, think about it.
Think about it. So that's a coup on the nation, not on the government.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying. It's a constitutional coup. Whereas the government doing it. It's time for election. The government feels that when I go into this election, I will lose. So I can just change the constitution. So I stay in power. You know, there are a number of countries within the sub-region did this. And the bloc was quiet. ECOWAS didn't issue a statement condemning what happened. So, if this is more of a constitutional coup, and you are quiet, how different is this from what happened in Mali? So, if I did something similar, the difference is that you are using the legal means, supposedly, to change the government because you are unpopular. I'm using the military. We are basically doing the same thing. So, why allow A and stop B? So if this is what you are doing, you are meddling into my private affairs, then I'm opting out. Basically, that's what happened. That when the military took over, because ECOWAS wanted to promote, you know, liberal values, the kind of system that we have in place, election, which is good. You know, that's what we need within a sub-region. Looking at how diverse, you know, the kind of diverse populations we have, peoples of different religion, actually. This is one way to keep the kind of entity that we have. So ECOWAS was actually promoting this, that, you know, organize periodic elections. Even though those who formed ECOWAS were men in uniform. When it was formed, you know, in 75, these were men in uniform. But ECOWAS had moved into promoting this whole idea of liberal democracy, which is good. You know, but if some of these things happen and ECOWAS is quiet, and you have coups taking place and, you know, ECOWAS comments, then these countries feel that now they want. But the other issue too is ECOWAS is an economic bloc. And so these countries that left, the official statement they put out is that they have left, but the economic agreements are still in place. So they are still in place. So basically it's just, as some would say, substance over form. You know, it's just on paper that they are no more part of ECOWAS, but, you know, the economic agreements that they signed and the ECOWAS is still in place. I haven't gone into it to see the extent to which that is true. But basically this is it. ECOWAS really doesn't really have power beyond.
So does this affect the collective effort you made mention?
Of course, yes, to some extent. Now, if these countries are not willing to buy into ECOWAS mode of addressing this insurgency, then there will definitely be a gap. And already that's what is happening.
Okay.
We see shifting allegiances. These three countries have, we hear of Russian soldiers involved. Of course, other African countries don't have that.
Okay.
So this effort, these shifting allegiances will definitely affect the way some of these things are addressed. This counter-insurgency effort. So I think beyond the politics of it, this is all politics, beyond the politics of it. And that is where I believe local structures and the systems we have in place before these modern borders can play important role. So let's say if the Hausa-speaking people in Niger, and the Hausa-speaking people in northern Nigeria have a collective way of addressing this. It doesn't matter what the government does. Governments can come and go. But because at the local level, there is a collective way of approaching it.
Exactly.
Even when governments go, even when governments have shifting alliances,
exactly,
that problem will be addressed. That's why I said that there are fundamental issues that we have to work around. Once we work around those fundamental issues, the fruits will yield positive results.
Okay. Now, looking at this whole, you are talking about fundamental issues and fundamental structures beyond military. And you said short term, looking at short term, they can use like the military unit and the rest. Should African governments prioritize military responses or stick with, regional blocs, regional bodies, architecture, security architecture?
So from where I sit, I have a bias, so I would say no, that shouldn't be prioritized because of my bias. Of course, someone in uniform will say yes.
Okay.
Yeah, that's about where I sit. So I did a research around human security.
Okay.
Where I feel that, so that's why I'm arguing that, restricting the role of our men in uniform. When you deploy the military, you are calling for military brutality. Sometimes you arrest people, the way they are handled, will change their mindset. You understand?
Exactly.
So this whole issue of insurgency, the way we interact with the other, I'm a northerner, for instance, and if I have a weird view about the Southern Nigeria. When I say northern, I don't mean northern Nigeria. I'm just giving an example. So if I'm a northern Nigerian and I have a weird view, a negative perception about the Southern Nigeria, how will the interaction take place? But if I have a positive view, then the interaction is different. You understand me? So that's why I'm basically arguing for some of these things. There are fundamental things that we can work around. Prioritizing military. America has the largest, military in the whole world. But even US have issues with terrorism. September 11th happened. Where were US counter-insurgency efforts? This counter-terrorism effort. They couldn't stop September 11th. Britain couldn't stop the July bombings in London. You understand? In Turkey, I think that was last year. So they also had. So yes, military is very, very important, but we cannot, military alone cannot address some of these issues. So my biases speak for the other approach.
Okay, away from your bias. Okay, let's talk about solidarity now and institutional support across, the Sahel. How can it be upheld to fight against insurgency? Looking at we're having fragmentations here and there.
So again, this goes back to what I mentioned earlier. If we approach it from bottom up, we can have fragmentations. But something like education is something we all agree on.
Across the Sahel.
Across the Sahel, we all agree on education. This is something we all need. Healthcare is something we all need. So if we work from that angle, as I said, the challenge, let me just chip in this, Julia, the challenge is we rely on government to do so many things. We rely on government. And unfortunately, this is positive for the politician because it gives him or her control.
Yeah.
Changing the narrative means you are weakening the power of the one in the center, the power of the politician. Not everyone will like it. So if these things are decentralized, if these things are decentralized and are approached from the communal level, there can be shifting allegiances. But because they are addressed at the base, these solutions, I believe, will work.
So you're still hammering on localizing structure.
Look at the Sahel. One dominant religion within the Sahel is Islam, right? Muslims listen to Muslim scholars at least one time, once a week, Friday. Today is Friday. During Friday prayers, they listen. Now, if all the scholars are speaking with one voice at Friday prayers, every Friday they speak with one voice. This is wrong. This is wrong. This is wrong. Think about how that will impact on the youth and those growing up. I don't know if you understand the point I'm making. It doesn't matter whether that person is in Nigeria or is in Sudan. When they speak the same voice, it impacts. The same way when you come to Saudi Nigeria, where you have, Christianity as the dominant religion. Be it so when Catholic priests are speaking the same language. This is the direction that we want the Catholic community to proceed. And if other churches are also using similar language, that this is the objective we have for our community, this is how we want it to go. Think about how that will affect the common people. So there are things that, as I said, that when we focus on, we have long-term benefits. I understand.
Okay, but just before I take your final words on this particular topic, let me put you on the spot here. It's not really putting you on the spot. Don't be on guard.
No
but,
problem.
Seeing that the Gulf region and the Gulf of Guinea is a strategic spot in Africa, and we're seeing how vast, how blessed Africa is, rich in resources, in trade and all that. Do you think terrorism is orchestrated or is coincident?
So I was trying to avoid this aspect of the discussion.
Okay.
Believe me.
Okay, why?
So I was trying to avoid it. But, that opinion is there. That looking at Nigeria,
okay,
and the role that Nigeria plays within the sub-region, and the role that Ghana and Nigeria played, Liberia, Ghana and Nigeria had to intervene. Ghana and Nigeria had to intervene in Gambia. Nigerians are very ambitious. Travel outside and see Nigerians. There was a time I saw a report. The Nigerian doctors who were, I think, was it in New York or one of these states, doing very well. And so that's the mentality of the typical Nigerian. You understand me? A Nigerian goes to a place, he or she wants to dominate the place. Wants to dominate. Now, that is positive, but again, that is negative for someone who wants to exercise effective control. Because I understand that the typical Nigerian has this attitude, and I want to control the area that Nigerians inhabit. One of the things that I'll do is to sow discord, is to create internal problem, so as to wreck, excuse my language, the kind of system that is keeping all this apart. I don't know if you understand the argument I make. So that argument is there, that whatever is happening within the sub-region cannot be detached from international politics, where you have this realist mentality. So realism has it that on the international terrain, power, the pursuit of power is what is important. If you want to be secure, pursue power. That's basically what realism is saying. And so if I have power, then I have to prevent my competitors, my enemies, from amassing that type of power that can threaten me. And basically, that's what the war in the Middle East is all about. And there are some academics who have argued that within the Sahel is the same theory that is working, but it's just that it has taken a different tangent from what is happening in the Middle East. Is that if I want power and Juliet is a threat, I have to weaken Juliet and weaken all those who support Juliet. How do I weaken it? Look at the Sahel, diverse group, get them to fight. Once they are fighting, you control the resources. So that theory is also there. That whatever is happening within the sub-region cannot be detached from international politics, which basically talks about the pursuit of power, realism, that is. But there are others who also say that, who disagree. I don't want to give my opinion, but I can tell you that, Juliet, sometimes when you want to put an information out there, you use the grapevine. you use a grapevine, rumor,
Mm.
to assess what people are saying.
Mm.
And so this is what we've been hearing on the grapevine. There is some truth to it. That I can see.
Okay.
That there is some truth to that theory.
So it's not based on. Okay. Let's
read about realism, and you will understand where those who are arguing, who are saying that is it, they will understand where they are coming from. And as I said, if you read that theory, then you will understand. For instance, let me just chip in this. The war in Libya is one of the reasons why you have all this happening. You know, these insurgent groups. So long as you had a stable government in Libya, we never had this problem. But why was Libya attacked and wrecked? The argument then was that late Gaddafi, was abusing the rights of Libyans. That was the argument. Why you had to get the UN to impose what it imposed. Are the rights of Libyans today being addressed, or is worse than when Gaddafi was in power? So the realists argue that the issue of Libya then was not about rights. It was to control Libyan resources, but use something as pretext to go into Libya, and that was the issue of human rights.
So what you're saying is that
that's what the realists is saying, not me.
Okay. I like the fact that you're putting it out there that okay, this is the theory.
Yes, that's what the realists
okay,
is saying.
What the realist is saying right now is that our fundamental issues in Sahel and in Africa is not really a coincidence.
Yes, that is not a coincidence.
Okay.
See, there was a research that someone went to Mali to engage in. This was when the French forces were in Mali. And the person conveyed the report when we came across the research that from her interactions with Malian citizens, they wanted the French out because the French was taking advantage of the resources. That they were happy to have the insurgents in place because they knew the insurgents were Malians. Yes, they were creating insecurity, but these were Malians. If it's the insurgents who are benefiting from Malian resources, they are Malians. It's better for them to benefit than from the French, because they were like the insurgents and the French, no difference. Okay. But one is European. You understand? So when the coup came, they welcomed the coup. You understand? So these were people who saw really feeding into the realist camp that is not about security, that is about the resources of the place. That to control the resources, create havoc. Once the havoc is ongoing, then you take advantage and take as much as you can. It happened in Sierra Leone and Liberia as well.
I mean, there are patterns of this, so it's inevitable to still trace it back to, it being orchestrated by, Western.
Exactly, that's the point. Yes, so that's what the realist camp is arguing.
Points the realist very well. Okay, before leaving, I would want you to say your final words on the way forward on border security in Africa, transnational insurgency. How do we tackle this entirely in Africa?
So first of all, I think if we really have to address this issue, we have to really look at the concept of security. When we say security, what are we really talking about? And the fact that people have different security needs. Mind you, our borders may be seen to be porous because there are people living in border towns who are trying to gain security for themselves. It may be economic security. For instance, people at the border areas may not be cooperating with the central or the federal government because of their economic needs. So you go there, you are smuggling, you give out an amount of money, they let you go because they have prioritized economic security. The federal government is prioritizing military security, and so it feels that is a problem. So we have to really look at this concept of security. And let's come up with a shared and collective idea around security. The security at the federal level should be in sync with the security in these communities. When this happens, I think we will be in a better position to address this. Also, beyond these communities, we have to really look, movement, across these countries. When, let's say, I travel and I get to the Benin-Nigerian border, and the bureaucracy is too much for me, what do you think I will do? I will use an unapproved route. And so these are things we have to really look at. And people have complained that the bureaucracy at the borders is too much to bear. As a Nigerian, you are a Nigerian, And I see you as Nigerian, right? But an outsider doesn't know the difference between a Ghanaian and a Nigerian. So the difference is basically something imposed. It's our mindset. You know, they are Nigerians and these are Togolese. Forgetting that we have a shared background. You know, you go to a place in Ghana, the Nigerian community is unthinkable. You know, Lagos town, for instance. When you go to Lagos town, you think, if they close your eyes and they take you there, they open, you think you're in Lagos. You understand? And so that is how connected we are as a people. So when we try to see each other as connected people, then the bureaucracy we impose at the border towns will reduce. Once we reduce these bureaucracies, then we're in a position to get people to move through the approved routes. Once they move through the approved routes, then there will not be the need to smuggle. I don't know if you understand the point I'm making. So this is a build-up to the fact that we have to have a shared view on security. When we don't have a shared view, then we cannot work on solution. The second solution that I'm suggesting, when we have a shared view on security, the Ghanaian knows that it is in his best interest for Nigeria to have security. And Nigeria knows that it is in its best interest for Benin to have security. Because if there is problem in Nigeria now, Nigerians will move to Ghana. Ghana will not have security. So when we have this whole collective view on security, and we work around it, then we can work on the second one. You know, these are the two solutions.
Thank you so much, Bashiru Muhammad, for your opinions and also highlighting that the realist theory has something to do with whether insurgency is orchestrated or a coincidence in Africa. Thank you so much once again.
Welcome.
Okay. And to our wonderful audience, you've heard it all from this episode. Sub-regional security, transnational insurgency in West Africa is a collective thing. It's not just Nigeria problem. It's not just Ghana problem. It's a collective thing that we together as Africans will really tackle. Thank you for staying tuned till this moment, and thank you for joining us here on 360 Youth Dialogue. I am Juliet Omura. Keep watching Third Eye Africa Television.